We now have approximately 25 minutes to talk about the different issues. And our speakers, who I can see on my monitor here, if they have any points they'd like to raise for each other or to elaborate on, if they could raise their hands, that would be fantastic. My first Twitter points are for Greg. I have a couple which relate to the graphs that he was showing on the increasing use of SSRN. My apologies for the pronunciation. Geike Garakana of the University of the Basque Country asks about the whether you have an explanation for the sudden peaks in authors and publications on your graph. And Andrew Gibson from London asks whether you feel that there is a singularity, that there is a maximal point of usage of publications, whether we are going to see a tailing off in the amount of scholarly publications.
There's a little bit of background noise there, Mike, but I think I followed the two questions. If not, just interrupt me at any point in time. First, the peaks in the author graph and the submission graph are related to when we actually ingested some repository content from other providers. If I remember correctly, the first one was the NBER. We actually have all of the NBER research and act as a backup for them. The second one was the IMF and World Bank content. And so you saw a peak with new authors, and you saw a corresponding peak with submissions into the system. And the third one was with actually coincided with two large associations and their conference back files that we brought into the system. So those are the kind of spikes, the 2 or 3 spikes that you saw on the specific graphs. The question as far as, is there a saturation point? I think that there is. I don't think we're there yet, because I think that people are swallowing content in a way that has not been the traditional way to do it. I remember starting off my career at KPMG a long time ago, and they would send around a copy of the table of contents, and you would circle in red pen and put initials next to it which articles you wanted a copy of, and you would get those copies on Friday, and that was your weekend reading file. And you would read the articles from beginning to end because you had only so many things to read. So I think that people are digesting content much faster. When we did a usability study at the University of Rochester, we saw the graduate students going to the reference section and scanning through the reference section. In STM, I know that some people actually look for figures and tables. So, the ability to provide a figure and table, the ability to provide the references quick and easily, I think is allowing people to work through a lot more content a lot faster. So I think there is some point where we're going to get there, but I just don't think we're there yet, because we're figuring out tools that allow us to consume a lot more content faster.
Fascinating, thank you. Daphne, did I see you raise your hand? No? Okay, fine. Sergei Komarov I imagine, of Russia, comments that there isn't very much participation in SSRN from Russia, or in fact in general to online repositories. Or is it just a question they're not producing enough, or maybe the culture doesn't incline to sharing material?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. There's obviously significant amounts of content being produced now in China, and the incentives have changed a bit, so you're seeing a lot more Chinese scholars put their research into a variety of places. PLOS One's a great example of how much content's coming from China and other Asian countries. I think that Russia's starting to put some incentives in place for sharing. I don't think that there's as much content being produced. I actually don't have a lot of data other than what we see at SSRN. And I think that there's some localization issues too. Just like I saw in India, there's people who say this is about my securities market or my social problem or our whatever it may be, and so they think that it's not maybe worth sharing. I think that those barriers are getting broken down, but certain places it's not happening as quickly as others.
Thank you. Jeremy, I've had several questions coming through to you asking about the software, how available it is, whether there are lists of resources, and a couple of questions about whether whether you feel that the proliferation of social technology in research is going to enable the growth of internationalism, specifically a question from Lily Mirafial in University of Tehran, asking about the possibility of cross-continent PhDs, where you have the supervisor in one continent and the student in another, perhaps, and how far you think that social networking tools of the type that you've described can go to replace, or do you feel that they're something that will just enhance scholarship?
So I'll start it in reverse and deal with that. I certainly think their best place at the moment is enhance. So the sort of cross-continental PhD where somebody might come to a university, move country to start their work PhD, learn some basic stuff, because even with discussions, videos, everything, it's still much easier and probably better to actually come to use some facilities. And in one of the examples I gave where our work on our lasers, there is just that facility. It's that intrinsically means you come to one place. But in many cases, once you've got some initial training, certainly once you know some of the people, the subsequent interactions are much better mediated over the current sort of exchange than they would have been in the past, where you could write letters to each other. But what's nice about some of the more social media is it isn't just a pairwise exchange. You can get advice and help from lots of people. So I think it's certainly going to enable a much greater sharing. And witness this video conference, I haven't had to travel anywhere. So it makes a huge advantage in fitting in other constraints of life. You know, there are other things as well that one wants to do than just do one's work. And what's nice is if you can use the modern technology to actually make your work-life balance better. And I think we're seeing some examples of that coming in now. So it actually opens up the pursuit of these topics in a way that requires dedication always, but not the same tight constraints as maybe in the past. So yes, the sharing and the support of research at a distance is much better. One of the difficult problems in working out, the usual problem is I've done what you told me to do, but it didn't work. Right? That's the normal starting point for a discussion. Now, the detail that then needs to be exchanged backwards and forwards to work out with the why. Was there a problem, or is that actually that's it? You haven't done anything wrong. That's the way it is. The more information that can flow backwards and forwards about that between groups of people, the easier it is to support that ongoing research. So I think it's these tools are tools, part of a suite. One of the problems I think we come to is that there are only a certain limited number of tools that one can master. If actually all the different communication mechanisms you need would mean that you need 20 or 30 tools monitoring 30 or 40 channels of communication, that's probably just not going to work. And somehow we need to be able to join together. So the joining up of different feeds and things is going to be essential. You spend all your time, well, I spend far too much of my time doing email anyway, answering questions when you need to sift things. So I think that's something we've got to be aware of. As far as our own software, it's available. The Labtrove stuff has got manuals and things. The current software is open source. What we are also in negotiations with is providing a service where a company in the UK called Liberata will provide the service. And that, of course, that doesn't necessarily come for free, because when you've got to actually run the systems and so on, it's a different matter. But the software is currently open source and available, and I'd love to hear from anybody who will be interested in it. The Labtrove stuff is at labtrove.org. But I'm very happy to provide more information, and people can, of course, contribute to it and write plugins for the system and so on. That's my point was to illustrate what can be done. It's possible to construct these systems in other ways, but we do have a product that will work very nicely. We find it extremely useful, and I'd love to share that experience with other people. So I'm very happy if people want to contact me to get more details on that, but they can do a search for Labtrove and find some of that, and also the associated papers on the Smart T system. And you'll see, for example, one of the open work, as I mentioned, the Open Notebook Science that Matt Todd in Sydney runs is a very good way of seeing some of the output as well.
Great stuff. Thank you, Jeremy. We'll try to include all the links to all the software on the page that we'll be putting up on researchtrends.com. But thank you very much for that. I have more tweets and more questions coming in than I could possibly hope to cover in the next 15 minutes. I think I've got one that I'm going to save for last because it's probably the most contentious. But I have a question here from Margaret Avery of MIT Press. She asks, and this is a general question for all of you, but I think perhaps we'll start with William. She asks, how can prestige and authority be retained in the accelerated process of making research available? And how might peer review adapt to keep a pace with faster timelines?
I think that's a really great question. A lot of the criticisms that you get when you talk about metrics online, altmetrics, as they've come to be known, is the criticism that this is all about quantity and not about quality, counting the number of page views or downloads or things like that. So clearly the next dimension, and one of the things that we're already looking at in some of our data, is this sort of iterative PageRank model where you look at not only how many connections are there, but what is the weight or the value of each of those connections itself. If you have a download or a member of one of your groups from someone who won the Nobel Prize in your field, that may count a little bit more than a download from someone who, as a graduate student is just starting out. So there's certainly a whole dimension of that we're not even capturing right now in terms of the qualitative side of things. I think what's going to happen with peer review is that eventually we're going to admit to ourselves that we can't possibly keep up with doing all of the peer review that needs to be done for all of the scholarly output on a pre-publication basis, and we're going to start to have to use smarter filters on a post-publication basis, or repository deposit, or publish to the web basis, to filter and review through those things. And you can see that for blog posts, we reached that point very, very quickly, and things came about to be able to surface and find the best blog content. And I'm just talking about Google, but I'm talking about things like Technorati and ScienceBlogs.com and things Science Seeker and things like that. So it's well overdue for us to have a system like that really works across the scholarly literature. And we're working very hard on some projects ourselves, and I know of a couple of things that are using the data that's available through our API. I didn't really stress that point, but it's very important to note that the data that I refer to isn't kept by us as our proprietary data, but we have it. All of it is available as open data through our API, and folks are using this data to come up with the recommender systems and smart filters for their particular field and or for the particular needs at that moment of the folks who are using their services. And there's a lot of interesting, I would call them, alpha or pre-alpha projects in this space right now that I'm watching very closely.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, do you have any additional thoughts on how prestige and authority can be retained in our brave new world of rapid scholarly research?
Well, I'm not sure retained. I mean, we have ourselves discussed the whole issue of cache. How do you build up this issue? So, you in the current environment, in the chemistry departments are big on tea rooms. You walk into the tea room and you say, so who do you think's the best at this? I want to find out something, and it's local and national. And parts of the discipline have very clear ideas of ranking. Somehow it's known. I mean, organic chemists, they know who the best organic chemist is. Other areas it's less clear. But I would put it the other way around, that in the current world, rapidly moving stuff, yes, but also access to it. We can acknowledge people who were hidden before. So if you're good at collecting data and putting it in a database, the fact that there may be 100 of you who are key, that's not a problem in creating that acknowledgement, whereas in the past those were forgotten. There's nothing new in this. So in the past, did you put in the technician who built the equipment? Maybe not in most cases. Sometimes you did. They got acknowledgements in a different way sometimes, but often not. but actually they may be absolutely key in getting the equipment to work. Otherwise it wouldn't have existed. So here we can open this up. So yes, it does get yet more complicated in working about who does what. Of course, journals now do require you in many cases to say what your contribution was, and maybe we need to formalize that a little bit to make it easier to process. But if those links are all in there, all the way back, giving you the context. So the context is not just how did this data get there, but who did it and why did they do that. Maybe subsequently we can process that information. So it may move around faster, but we have computational systems that can maybe help us and bring these things to the top. It may not give you the same result as asking people what they think about who is the best person that they've come across. And then the question is, who's right? Are you swayed by the person who gave the best talk recently, who may be the best at presenting the data? If you want to ask the question, who do I hire to get so I can do your experiment as well? That may be a very different question from who is the best person I think give the new ideas. So I think it's a really complicated issue. All we are doing now is we're getting more of that information. But we also can do a better job at working out who was really behind it. Now, whether you want to spend the time and effort doing that is another problem. But I think actually we've got more information out there again, and we can get better value answers. We just don't quite know how to ask the right questions at the moment. I think it's asking, what do you really mean by the reputation? That may be more difficult to solve and more important to solve at this stage than how are you going to determine that.
And thank you for raising a very important subject, which is, well, to me it's a very important subject, that of contributorship and formal contribution definitions. It's something that I've been working on for the last year, and that I suspect my colleague Gudmundur Thorsson will be introducing in his presentation in the second half. The final point I want to raise before we close our first session today is another point raised by Andrew Gibson. It is likely, it could be seen as being a contentious issue. Andrew says that he's noticed the terms strategic access and intelligent access being used, and speculates whether people are getting bored of open access. I wonder who would like to kick off on that discussion, whether Greg might have an opinion or would like to. Gali.
Sure. I'll share it. Clearly, I get the easy question. Thanks, Mike. I think that it's it's a landmine to say, oh, open access is good, and it's a landfill to say open access is bad. I think that research should be shared, and what that means and what open means, I think need to be well thought out. I've sat in many conferences with somebody pounding on the podium saying everything should be open without any cost or concern about how to pay for it. And I think that in my view, is naive. Things need to get paid for, whether they're paid for by the university, whether they're paid for with premium services like SSRN. However it works out, it needs to be paid for. And so I do think that there are some people who are a little bit tired of the phrase open access. I don't think, though, that it's overused or burned out, or we've kind of run to the end of that road yet.
So, Greg.
I was just going to say one. Let me just say one more quick point, William. I think that kind of in between the last question and this question, and Jeremy talked about it a little bit, and William talked about it a little bit. there's a question of quality, and I saw that Kelly, tweeted something out. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody tweets it, is it still important? And so I think that the word quality needs to be put in quotes, but we need to be thinking about, it's not about open, it's not about access, it's about how do we find the stuff that actually helps create innovative research faster. And if one paper is read by one person and that one person cures cancer because of that paper, then it's quality. It doesn't matter how many tweets, it doesn't matter how many downloads or how many citations, then it's quality and it has real impact. And so, it's easy to point the finger at open access and say it's good or bad, but I think it's just a part of the path that we're on, and we just need to understand that instead of trying to vilify it or put it up on a pedestal. Thanks.
William, you
Yeah,
had an observation?
Actually, Greg led into the very observation I was going to make, because I do think that the quality aspect is important. From my perspective, from where I stand, it seems to me like open access is something that a lot of folks have been working very hard on for a very long time, but with the recent changes in the UK to mandate open access, with the recent increased enforcement of the NIH mandate in the US, it seems like we're getting very close to having the access that we've been struggling for a very long time. So an interesting question that has come up for me is, once we do have this access to everything, and we can look across the breadth of what is available, then we can start asking interesting questions about how are the individual pieces connected and put into context with one another, which is naturally where metrics come in. So if you're seeing any fatigue, so to speak, with the phrase open access, it's really just a victim of its own success thus far. And I think we naturally are going to move towards having people aware of the idea and the importance of open access, and it remains very important, okay, so we've got good access, now how do we move to the next level and sort and filter through the things that we now have access to?
So I've got a question.
What people are seeing, just if I could add one final thing, we do definitely see, if you look at the papers that have been, the primary journal articles that have come out in PubMed this year, there is a significant there's significantly more readers on Mendeley of the open access papers than the non-open access papers. And this might, these are just rudimentary numbers that I arrived at, not as part of a scholarly study of the issue, but in some work I was doing for the Reproducibility Initiative. So it may be a little bit skewed by the fact that PLOS One publishes such a large volume of stuff these days, so it's throwing the averages off a little bit. But certainly there's a lot more open access content out there, and we're seeing that it is read, the attention is being paid to it at a higher degree than other kinds of content.
Thank you. I had a question in New York. I'll come to Jeremy in a minute, but if there was a question in New York, is that Kelly?
Hi.
Hi, Kelly.
Nice to be here, finally. So I've got a question about what Dr. Gunn was just discussing. So Greg here brought up the issue of quality, but we're also talking about quality in the context of open access. So I guess I'm wondering, it seems to me that access to everything is a sort of counter to quality, in terms of it's more difficult to enforce any sort of quality regime if you're also at the same time emphasizing access to everything by anyone. So how would you deal with that in terms of them being sort of competing forces?
Yeah, so I think what this brings up is that quality has a lot of different definitions to different people. Whereas in the past, we have had sort of this, or have sought to have a centralized definition of quality, and this was enshrined in some ways in the journal impact factor. What we're seeing now in our data is that different communities value different research articles and different works in different ways, and you can see that in the sharing patterns, you can see that in the readership patterns. And so this concept of quality as a thing really has to shift to more of a concept of appropriateness for a particular area at a particular place in time for a particular application, as opposed to this monolithic centralized definition of quality.
Just to add on to William's point, somebody asked me what is quality at a panel last fall, and I said, well, it's, I define it like beauty or pornography, right? It's in the eyes of the beholder, and it's impossible to say that this is quality for any sort of metrics. And so, this roll your own kind of approach, I think, is important in that if it is all open, then we're going to find the things that have impact or quality, because they're not going to be necessarily hidden away. And from an SSRN perspective, we think it's very important that the accountant's view of Sarbanes-Oxley gets shared with the economists and the lawyers and the sustainability researcher, so that they get this cross-pollination of ideas, because it's not just from our world about, let me continue to hand off the research to the same people that I've handed off to, or the readers of this one journal. And so it's a sharing of ideas. And the reader, I think, has to take on some level of responsibility, because they are going to get more information, and use the tools that are out there to help determine what's quality to them.
Thank you very much. I have more questions than we could answer in probably an hour now. They're still coming in. What I'll do is I'll try and route these round to you, so we can perhaps take them offline and add them to an appendix. I have one question which isn't aimed at anybody in particular, but it's a question close to my heart. It sort of goes back to the question we had coming in from Tehran, but Dr. Karakoram of Pakistan asks whether we can hope to see the promotion of a research culture in developing countries. And I wonder if perhaps Jeremy might like to touch upon that.
I think actually, yes, and there is a research culture in the developing countries, and a lot of it, actually, a lot of computing stuff is actually one of the things that is more available to them than doing some of the other expensive facilities, though there are often ways in which they can be encouraged to travel to some. But I think it comes back to the heart of, what are our responsibilities as a researcher? What is it that you're trying to put in as a research culture? And that actually it goes back to this, what is about open access, because I certainly feel open access is very important, but it's a debate about how do you best make the information you are going to put out into the community as a part of a publication available to the maximum number of people, or to the number of people you wish it to be available. It does depend on why the research was funded and what you're aiming to do. But it comes, my next phrase, and why we've moved on from open access to things like intelligent access, is what is it that you're putting out and making open? And we have responsibilities as a researcher to put out the necessary information to reproduce the work, or for people to be able to judge. There's a phrase in the UK when you're coming to buy a house, caveat emptor, it's your responsibility. Buyer beware. You do the check. To some extent, we are moving into that field with the data. Whenever you use data or research or look at the literature, you have to think yourself whether or not this is valid. And is it valid for the use that you're going to make of it? You have a responsibility to do that, but you have a responsibility to show what you have done to others to make sure they can understand what you've done. We have all of these, we've grown up this economy of checks and balances to help you, be a peer review and so on. When its original idea was to help look and look back and give people an idea how to improve their papers, or if they've missed something. We are perhaps pushing more and more of this back to the researcher again to understand that and not just take it at face value. So we do have responsibility as a researcher to do things right and to explain what we've done and put that and make that go forward. So open access may make it easier to read the paper. Does it make it easier to understand it or use it? That depends on the quality of the data. We've talked about that, the quality of the explanations and the depth of those. So that, I think, is something that I would like to see places starting up a research culture from ground up to actually get into their new students. What are the responsibilities to do a good job? That they are the best placed person to describe the research that they actually did. And that's, they're the people putting the novelty in. And let them explain that and expound on it and get the credit for it as well.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I would like to say at the end of this first session of our seminar, a very big thank you to our three speakers, Dr. William Gunn on the West Coast, Greg Gordon in New York, and Professor Jeremy Frey, who we've just heard speaking from the University of Southampton. It's been a fascinating 2 hours, and we're going to take a 30-minute break now. We're coming back on the half hour, where the next half of our presentation on evaluating networks is going to take place. And I'm looking forward to welcoming Dr. Gudmunda Torresson, Kelly Barr from the University of North Texas, and Dr. Heather Pivawar from Impact Story and previously Total Impact. Thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you in half an hour.